Welcome to the Living History series of the DC Charter School Alliance. Today we're talking with the Venerable BB Otero. What a pleasure to have you with us today, BB. Thank you so much. Would you please begin by giving us a little bit of your own history?
All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Ramona. My own history is at least for these purposes, the best way to begin is that I came to the United States when I was 10 years old and went into DC public schools in the early 60s. As the years went by, I became a DC public school teacher. And then a parent of 3 children in the public school system and a PTA president for many years, and worked in the nonprofit sector primarily around education issues with Latino and African American families and children in the Adams Morgan, Columbia Heights, Mount Pleasant neighborhoods. And so my history in the district has always been one of community development through an educational lens.
Yes. Well, BB, you and I go back to the 70s. So your work is truly valued in the DC, the greater Washington area. And once again, we thank you. So let me ask you, BB, what was public education like in the District of Columbia before chartering?
I think the District of Columbia had been struggling for a very, very long time. And I don't think it was necessarily just the public school system, but it was the context, the racial context, the social context of the District of Columbia during the 60s, post-60s, desegregation, home rule. I think you have to put all those things into context to be able to say, so what was happening to public education? Not unlike what was happening to social supports and what was happening to a lot of the various social issues within the District of Columbia. They were so intertwined with the racial issues and the disenfranchisement of the District of Columbia at the federal level that created a whole host of issues for the city.
I was just going to ask you if you wouldn't mind going into that a little more deeply. I completely agree, the intertwined nature of it, but many of those who listen to this interview may not have any of that history. So Please provide a little more.
Well, we definitely, we are, because we're still a city controlled by the federal government in so many ways. But if you think about the 60s and the moving from being controlled by a set of commissioners appointed by the feds who didn't live in the city, who didn't know the city, who didn't really care about the city, a city that had gone through desegregation and had huge disparities in neighborhoods as a result of that, and as a result of some infrastructural decisions made in the District of Columbia, whether it's 295 or anything else that began to really separate our neighborhoods even beyond how segregated neighborhoods were. And we saw the building of, for example, public housing in set areas of the city in large numbers compared to other areas of the cities. And so east of 295, you had a huge number of public housing that got built during the 60s. So then it meant a concentration of our poorer communities, many of that being African Americans. Fast forward to the 70s and the 80s, and you have DC a bit of a mecca for immigration and for folks coming out of Latin America, war-torn due to much of the policies of the United States in Latin American countries. And DC became one of the 5 places across the country where we had a significant number of immigrants. Those began to be clustered in neighborhoods of poverty. And so you had a school system, back to your original question, that was struggling to figure out how to provide the supports with a poorly funded school system to all of those communities that had not only the educational needs, but a whole host of social needs that were a part of that. And so I think it's always really important to put into context what was happening to our educational system into the context of what was happening in the District of Columbia as a whole. In the midst of all that, you know that we had tremendous white flight. And so that many of the folks in the district who were of means, and a school system that is mixed and integrated across social and economic classes is one that thrives much more than one that is left to support all of the poorest children in the city. And that's really what you saw in the district. You saw white flight to the suburbs, to Ward 3, and the same with the flight of the wealthier African-American communities up to Northern Ward 3 and 4, as well as to Prince George's County. And so it left a relatively poor, primarily African-American community that needed a huge set of supports and an educational system that would benefit. And that's where I think we start with, so what to do with public education in the district. I don't know if that gives you enough of the BB perspective.
It's definitely helpful. And particularly, as I say, for so many who don't know anything really about this history. But then what was the point and purpose of chartering in DC?
Well, I think there were a number of things that happened. Politics of the federal government played a big role in charters at the time that we saw the School Reform Act in 1996, I believe, where, again, because we're under the control of the federal government, and there were many Republicans who wanted to see a voucher system in the District of Columbia, began to have that move towards instituting some sort of a voucher system in the district. Ultimately, and I'm sure those who are better historians than I am will have better details, but the end game was a compromise to a voucher and charter and continued support for our public education, our traditional public education system. And so it was the political workings between the federal government, our local council, our Board of Education, and education advocates within the District of Columbia that ultimately came to this School Reform Act of 1996 that sets a sort of a three-sector educational system in the District of Columbia.
What would you say about the opportunity that chartering afforded for some of the wraparound services and social supports that you were speaking of being added to the educational portfolio?
I have to be really honest with you. I was one of the very early skeptics. I was one of those advocates I had been a PTA president for many years. My kids were in public education. I am a great believer of public education as the equalizer, and was very fearful of what was coming down the pipe with charters and vouchers in the District of Columbia. And with a little bit of arm twisting, was asked to join the initial board in 1997, I'm sorry, that was appointed by then Secretary Riley and the mayor. And if you recall, at that time, the appointments of the charter board appointments for the independent charter board, because the school board at that time was still a school board and was a school board that was was also an authorizer, and in fact had been the initial authorizer. We were then appointed as the initial board to basically establish the independent board and its processes and strategy. And so that what we aimed to do then was to really look at ways in which charters could really be a manifestation of a community process, and that charters would come out of local communities and organizing out of local communities, and that those communities would then determine what services and what needs there were in that community, and why a charter school for that community would be would be the best response. And that we thought that what that would do is allow for places where public education was not strong in certain communities, some options for children and families. And so that was, I think, very much at the heart of the initial board and the way the initial board set the processes for the charter board.
Yes, I agree. And have some of the schools been able to realize this bright vision and this opportunity for the whole child, the whole family, the community input, the wraparound services? And have you noticed any best practices that could then and should then be shared so that all of the children in public education might benefit from them?
Certainly at the beginning of the charter movement, the charter process in the district, I think at that we began to see some really key programs developed in communities that were responsive to very specific community needs. If you look at the initial charters, for example, I think one was for teen parents, and making sure that teen parents had a space where they could come with their children and have and be able to meet their educational aspirations. There were others that were focused. There was a lot of focus at the very beginning with older children, where we, I think, saw the biggest gaps in the public education system. So it was middle school. The middle school was always the big challenge. High school retention was always the big challenge. And so what you saw, I think, early on was attempts by local community groups to really begin to move towards some alternative educational programs, or well, let me not call them alternative education, but some alternatives to the traditional public education. And so you saw, for example, Paul Charter School, which had been a public school, a traditional public school, become a charter school and be able to structure its own programs and services for kids in that neighborhood up in the Petworth area. So I think you early on we saw that. I mean, it's been 25 years, and so charters have evolved in a very significant way. You know, I worry a lot about the conglomerates. I worry about the fact that we have huge numbers of schools that are part of sort of national entities, and that we may have lost some of that local community engagement and involvement in the actual development of a school for a community. So I do worry about that. But at the same time, and as you've asked, what are some of the things that have been positives and we can learn from? I think certainly the number of schools that developed in bilingual, trilingual, multilingual opportunities for children. As an immigrant myself, and as a child who came to this country without English, boy, would I have benefited from a bilingual school, and not had some of the still lingering issues of being a second language learner in English, right? From looking at the push that there was for bilingual schools to serve immigrant communities in the charter movement, I think that also pushed the traditional educational system to do a better job in its bilingual schools. So I think that one of the things that we had hoped is that these two systems would feed each other and would help each other do better. And I think to some degree, some of that has happened in certain areas of work. I still think we have a lot of issues on the high school retention and high school graduation. I don't necessarily think that one has done a much better job than the other in terms of where we are in what's happening to our young people as they try to complete their high school education. I think our elementaries have really strengthened a lot in both ends. As you well know, years later, I started a charter school. I started DC Bilingual Public Charter School. I'm very proud of the fact that we have a school that is fully bilingual alongside many of the others and is serving that community. I think we also saw a number of schools developed in Ward 7 and 8, and in Ward 8 in particular, where we had probably some of the weakest schools in our traditional public educational system. And so there are places where I think charter schools have had a significant impact. And I think that there has been some healthy competition between the two systems.
How has the original intent changed over the years, for better or for worse? And where do you see the district now that nearly half of the public school children in the District of Columbia are enrolled in charter schools? What has the change brought?
Well, one of the changes I mentioned earlier, I think, is these sort of school systems within a system that are led by national organizations. That's taken away from me a bit of what sort of homegrown charter schools could be. And then maybe that's just a natural evolution, especially as charters became more of a national. We were very early. We were one of the first. And so as charter schools took up more educational space across the country, it was, I think, natural for us to see the growth of these charter operators across the country consolidating in some way. So I think that that's part of what we've seen. I think that even when even in my early years, what was the 6 or 7 years that I served on the board, we always asked the question, when is enough? When is there a balance? And I think every board has asked itself that, has tried to look at managing that through the application process, through how many schools were authorized on any given year, trying to look at geographic distribution. So I think, and I would encourage the board to always be looking at that and look at saturation points and look deeper at issues that may be impacting our children and our communities. If we created too many schools and made it more difficult for some schools to have all the resources they need to be able to provide, especially in the upper grades, right, in the high schools and middle schools. And I know there have been some very creative ways of collaboration, and I think that's going to be the next big thing, is how do they collaborate in order for sports and sciences and competition and those kinds of things to be afforded to kids regardless of where they are in school. And the closer the two systems come in meeting each other's the needs of each of these schools to be able to afford kids as many of the resources as possible, I think the better we will be across the board as a educational system in the district.
Yes, yes, yes. And my last question is, what is your own thinking right now, your own feeling, and if you have any intentions to help make that happen? And any last thoughts you have on the subject that maybe I haven't thought to ask that you think we should share?
As you know, my first love has always been early childhood education. And so I am really focused on helping the district understand how it better serves our youngest children. And that is really not a role for public education, I don't believe, our infants and our toddlers. It's about building a system of care for infants and toddlers that includes childcare, but it is having really strong health, a really strong health system, really strong supports. For example, we have a community where there is significant, over 90% health coverage, yet we have some of the worst health indicators for our young children and our moms. And so the issue of supply and the issue of access are huge. The health disparities are significant, and those health disparities show up in school. And our schools then have to deal with those as our children are growing up. And so my hope is that we can do better at supporting an early care and education system in the district that then complements what we do in K-12 in a really robust way, and that there are places where those partnerships are strengthened, that we respect the teachers that we have in early care and education, that workforce is in parity with the workforce in public education, and that our investments across systems, and that we really look at education from a 0 to 21 perspective, understanding that they are very different at different stages of children's development. And so that's where I want and continue to spend a great deal of my time. And it's not as simple as saying, well, let somebody else take over. It really is about a mindset in this city about what we believe our most valuable assets are our children.
Thank you so much, BB.
Thank
Really
you.
appreciate it. And
Well, thank you for thinking of me.
Oh, absolutely. And we'd like to thank all who are listening to this Living History series segment with BB Otero from the DC Charter School Alliance. Thank you.